Gather close and listen. The stories that blow in on the desert wind are usually about men as hard as the rock they walk on. But I've found that the desert doesn't care about your station, your breeding, or your gender. It's a furnace. It burns away everything you thought you were, and shows you what you're truly made of. This is a story about a woman who was forged in that furnace. A woman who traded silk gloves for leatherwork gloves, and porcelain teacups for the cold, hard steel of a gun. It's the tale of a blacksmith they called the Iron Rose, and how she taught a town of hardened men the true meaning of strength. The town of Dust Devil Gulch was a place that clung to the scorched earth of the Arizona desert like a stubborn, thorny weed. It was a town of last chances, a collection of sun-bleached, heat-warped buildings populated by men who were running from a past or chasing a future that was as thin and shimmering as the heat haze on the horizon. It was a man's world, forged in grit, sweat, and the casual brutality of the frontier. Power was measured in the weight of a man's purse or the speed of his gun hand. It was a hard place, and it had no time for weakness, and certainly no time for a lady, which made the town's blacksmith an anomaly, a source of constant, low-grade astonishment to the dusty miners and hardened ranchers who relied on her skills. The blacksmith of Dust Devil Gulch was not a burly, bearded man with arms like tree trunks. She was a woman. Clara McCall was 24 years old, though the harsh desert sun and the weight of her past made her seem older. She was not a large woman, but she moved with a coiled, efficient strength, her body honed by the relentless, rhythmic work of the forge. Her face, usually smudged with a streak of soot, was a study in contradictions. It held the fine, aristocratic bone structure and the delicate features of a porcelain doll, but her eyes, the color of a stormy gray sea, were old, watchful, and held a look of such profound, unbreakable resolve that no man who met her gaze dared to call her delicate. Her hands, too, were a paradox. They were slender and long-fingered, the hands of a pianist or a painter, but they were also strong, calloused, and stained with the honest grime of her trade, capable of shaping red-hot iron with a craftsman's precise and powerful grace. To the people of the town, she was a quiet, formidable enigma. They knew her as Clara, the blacksmith. They relied on her to shoe their horses, repair their wagons, and sharpen their plows. They respected her skill, which was second to none. But they also feared her, just a little. They had seen her on a few rare occasions when a drunken cowboy or an arrogant drifter had mistaken her for an easy target, handle a pistol with a speed and an unnerving, cold-blooded accuracy that was the equal of any gunfighter who had ever passed through town. They had taken to calling her, in hushed, respectful tones, the Iron Rose, a name that perfectly captured her blend of delicate beauty and dangerous and yielding strength. What they did not know was that Clara McCall was a ghost, a refugee from another life so far removed from the dust and heat of this town that it might as well have been another planet. She had been born Clarissa McAllister, the cherished only daughter of a wealthy, aristocratic family in Philadelphia. Her world had been one of tea and lace, of literary salons and grand balls, of a future that had been meticulously planned to include a suitable marriage and a life of refined, sheltered ease. She had been raised to be a prize, a delicate flower in a well-tended garden. That world had been consumed by fire and blood 5 years ago. A brutal, targeted home invasion, a robbery gone wrong the papers had called it, had claimed the lives of her father, her mother, and her 2 older brothers. Only Clarissa, hidden in a secret priest's hole by her father in his last moments, had survived, listening in mute, helpless terror to the screams of her family and the cold, professional voices of their killers. When she had finally emerged from the darkness, it was to a world of carnage and ashes. She had seen the faces of the men, had heard a name spoken, and knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was no random robbery. It was an execution. And they would come back for her if they knew she had survived. So, Clarissa McAllister had died in that house with her family. A new person, Clara McCall, had been born from the trauma. She had taken what cash she could find, cut her hair, disguised herself as a boy, and fled west, a nameless, terrified fugitive. The West had been a brutal and unforgiving crucible, but in it, she had discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. She had found her way to a small, isolated mining town and apprenticed herself to an old, kindly blacksmith who, seeing the fire in her eyes, had taken pity on the boy and taught him the trade. In the relentless, physical work of the forge, in the heat and the hammerfall, Clara had found a strange kind of solace. She was not just shaping iron, she was reforging herself, hammering the soft, frightened girl she had been into something new, something hard and strong and capable of surviving in this new, savage world. Now, in Dust Devil Gulch, she had a life. It was a hard, solitary life, a life lived in the shadows of a past she could never speak of. Her forge was her sanctuary, the ringing of her anvil a song that drowned out the memories she kept to herself, her interactions with the townsfolk brief and professional. She was their blacksmith, nothing more. But at night, in the small, Spartan room behind her forge, the ghosts would return. She would clean the match set of cold peacemakers she had inherited from her father, a man who had been a gentleman but also a crackshot, and she would remember the faces, and the name, and the promise she had made to herself in the smoking ruins of her old life. She was not just a survivor, she was a witness. Her carefully constructed, solitary peace is about to be shattered. A new shadow is falling over the territory, a threat that will force her to choose between the quiet anonymity she has cultivated and the fierce, protective spirit that was forged in the same fire that consumed her family. The threat has a name spoken in fearful whispers across the desert: Hurricane Dalton. A man, it is said, who leaves only dust and widows in his wake. He is coming to Dust Devil Gulch, and his arrival will force the Iron Rose to show the world not just her petals, but her thorns. The name Hurricane Dalton was not just a nickname, it was a weather forecast. He and his gang of 20-odd riders were a force of nature, a destructive storm that swept across the Arizona territory, leaving a trail of shattered communities in their wake. Dalton was a new breed of outlaw, a man who blended the brutal, old-world tactics of a warlord with the cold, modern logic of a corporate raider. He didn't just rob towns, he acquired them. His method was brutally effective. He would isolate a small, independent town, cut off its supply lines, terrorize its populace with a series of escalating raids, and then, when the town's spirit was broken and its economy was in shambles, he would offer to buy the town's key assets mine, the water rights. The main business cess for a fraction of their worth through a front company. It was conquest by economic strangulation, and it was devastatingly effective. For weeks, Dust Devil Gulch had been feeling the first, telltale shifts in the wind that signaled the hurricane's approach. A stagecoach carrying the payroll for the local silver mine was hit, a brazen, professional job that left 3 guards dead. A neighboring ranch was burned to the ground, its owner found shot in the back. The telegraph lines, the town's only link to the outside world, were cut. The town was being isolated, softened up. A quiet, creeping fear began to seep into the dusty streets, as thick and choking as a sandstorm. The town's leadership, such as it was utterly unprepared for such a sophisticated threat. The mayor was a pompous, ineffectual saloon owner named Jedediah Price, a man whose authority was derived from the size of his whiskey barrels. The sheriff, a weary, aging man named Elias Thorne, was a good man at heart, but he was out of his depth. He had one young, green deputy and a deep-seated desire to avoid any trouble that couldn't be solved with a stern talking to. The town was a ripe plum, waiting to be plucked. Clara McCall, from the fiery heart of her forge, watched the growing fear with a cold, analytical eye. She was a woman who understood the mechanics of stress and breaking points, both in steel and in men. She saw the familiar patterns of a predator circling its prey. The targeted, escalating violence, the severing of communications. It was all eerily reminiscent of the cold, professional precision of the men who had destroyed her family. These were not common bandits. This was an organized, intelligent operation. Her instincts were confirmed when a new stranger rode into town. He was not a dusty prospector or a worn-out cowboy. He was a man dressed in a fine, but travel-stained, city suit, his face clean-shaven, his eyes cold and appraising. He introduced himself as Mr. Cole, a representative of the Great Western Development Company. He began to move through the town, speaking to the business owners, the mine supervisor, offering a sympathetic ear to their fears about the Dalton gang. He spoke of the need for security and stable investment. He began to subtly, quietly, make offers to buy out the panicked citizens, offers that were insultingly low but, in the face of the growing threat, increasingly tempting. Clara saw him for what he was immediately. He was the vulture, the harbinger of the storm, the man who came in to pick the bones after the hurricane had passed. She saw in his cold, reptilian eyes the same soulless greed she had seen in the eyes of the men who had murdered her family. The town was being played, caught in a perfectly executed pincer movement of terror and economic pressure. The people were being driven into a cage of fear, and Mr. Cole was holding the key, offering them an escape at the price of their freedom and their livelihood. Clara's past had taught her a bitter lesson. When faced with wolves, you could not reason or hide. You had to become a wolf yourself. She knew she could no longer remain a quiet, anonymous blacksmith. The storm she had been running from for 5 years had finally found her in a different form, but with the same cold, predatory heart. She began to make her own quiet preparations. She worked late into the night, her forge glowing like a defiant star against the encroaching darkness. But she was not just shoeing horses or repairing wagons. She was forging weapons. She began to modify the hunting rifles of the few ranchers she trusted, improving their range and accuracy. She designed and crafted small, ingenious, and deadly booby-trap spring-loaded dart throwers, caltrops to cripple horses, and tripwires connected to deafeningly loud alarms. And in the deepest hours of the night, she would go out into the desert surrounding the town, her father's matched Colts on her hips, and she would practice. Her movements were a fluid, deadly dance, the two guns speaking in a rolling thunder, her accuracy unnerving, almost inhuman. She was no longer just honing her skills, she was reawakening a part of herself she had tried to bury, the part of her that had been born in the fire of her family's murder. The other men in town watched her with a mixture of suspicion and a dawning, grudging respect. They saw the quiet, intense purpose in her eyes. They saw the way she studied the terrain around the town, the way she seemed to be calculating angles and fields of fire. They did not understand what she was doing, but they understood that the Iron Rose was preparing for a war they were all too terrified to even acknowledge was coming. The atmosphere in Dust Devil Gulch had grown as tight and brittle as sun-baked glass. The hurricane was no longer a distant threat. His presence was a suffocating weight on the town. Dalton's riders, growing bolder, would appear on the ridges overlooking the town, their silhouettes dark and menacing against the setting sun, a silent, constant reminder of the town's vulnerability. The final straw came when they rode down and seized the town's only deep-water well, the lifeline of the entire community, claiming it as their own and demanding a tax for every bucket drawn. It was a classic act of strangulation, and it worked. Panic, raw and undisguised, flooded the streets. Mayor Price convened a town meeting in the saloon. The room was a cacophony of fear and anger. Men shouted, blaming the sheriff for his inaction, blaming each other for their cowardice. The slick and reassuring Mr. Cole was there, of course, moving through the crowd like a priest, offering his company's protection in exchange for the town signing over the deed to the silver mine. It was a surrender disguised as a business deal, and the desperate townspeople were on the verge of accepting it. It was into this scene of collapsing morale that Clara McCall walked. She did not enter with a swagger or a shout. She entered with the quiet, deliberate calm that was her trademark. The room fell silent as she walked to the front, the men parting before her as if she were carrying a lit stick of dynamite. She was not dressed in her blacksmith's leathers, but in simple, practical buckskin trousers and a man's shirt, her father's matched Colt strapped to her hips. Her face was clean of soot, and her stormy gray eyes were fixed on the mayor. "You are about to sell our souls for a drink of water, Mayor Price," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying to every corner of the silent room. "You are handing the keys to our home to the very man who has his foot on our throats." "And what do you suggest we do, Miss McCall?" the mayor sneered, his face flushed with whiskey and indignation. "You're a blacksmith, not a general. Dalton has 20 guns. We have a tired sheriff and a boy." "You are wrong," Clara replied, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the assembled men. "You have more than that. You have a silver mine. You have a dozen ranches. You have this town. You have a home. And you have me." She took a step forward. "I will not speak to you of courage. I will not speak to you of honor. I will speak to you of practicality. If you surrender, you lose everything. If you fight, you might lose everything. But you also might not. The choice is between a certain death and a chance at life." "Fight with what?" a miner yelled from the back. "Our fists." "You will fight with this," Clara said. She reached into a large canvas bag she was carrying and pulled out one of the rifles she had modified, tossing it to the miner. She then pulled out a series of her ingenious booby traps, laying them on the bar. "And you will fight with this," she said, tapping her temple. Dalton expects a mob of frightened men with guns. He does not expect an organized, intelligent defense. He thinks he is a hurricane, a mindless force of nature. "We will be the rock that breaks him. We will not meet him in the open field. We will turn this entire town into a trap, a maze of death from which he will not escape." Her words, her sheer, unshakable confidence, and the tangible evidence of her preparations had a stunning effect. She was not offering them vague platitudes about courage. She was offering them a plan, a strategy, a chance. She was speaking their language, the language of practicality, of survival. In that room, a fragile and likely alliance was forged. It was not born of friendship, but of a shared, desperate need. Clara found her first and most important ally in an unexpected quarter, Sheriff Elias Thorne. The weary, aging lawman saw in Clara the spark of the fighter he had once been. Her courage shamed him, and in doing so, it reawakened his own. He walked to the front of the room and stood beside her. "She is right," he said, his voice finding a strength it hadn't held in years. "I have been content to keep the peace. But there is no peace to be kept with a hurricane. There is only survival. I am with her." His endorsement was a crucial turning point. Others, seeing the town's only symbol of law siding with the strange, formidable blacksmith, began to step forward. The miners, the ranchers, the shopkeepers, she were a disorganized, frightened lot, but they were no longer a mob. They were the beginnings of an army. Over the next few days, under Clara's tireless, expert direction, Dust Devil Gulch was transformed. It was no longer a town, it was a fortress. But it was a fortress of the mind, a place of traps and misdirection. The main street, the obvious point of attack, was left wide open, an inviting, obvious target. But the buildings on either side were turned into interconnected snipers' nests. Tunnels were dug, connecting cellars. Barricades were constructed not in the open, but in the narrow alleyways, creating deadly choke points. Clara's booby traps were placed with a cunning, psychological insight, not just in obvious places, but in spots designed to fray the nerves and sow confusion. A tripwire on a saloon door that did not trigger a gun, but a deafeningly loud bell. A patch of ground that looked solid but would give way to a deep pit filled with sharpened stakes. Clara moved through the preparations like a master craftsman, her forge now the entire town. She instructed the men in the use of the modified rifles, her knowledge of the weapons she had forged intimate and absolute. She organized the women, turning them into a network of medics and suppliers. She was not just a general, she was the architect of their survival. Mr. Cole, the representative of the development company, watched these preparations with a cold, growing sense of alarm. His plan to acquire a broken, desperate town was being thwarted by the one person he had dismissed as irrelevant. He saw that the town was no longer a ripe fruit, ready to fall into his hands. It was growing thorns. And Iron Rose, the blacksmith who was meant to be a part of his acquisition, was the one who was forging them. He sent a frantic rider out to Dalton's camp, warning him that the town was not as soft a target as they had believed. The hurricane, he warned, was about to hit a wall of iron. As Dust Devil Gulch braced for the coming storm, Clara found herself haunted by the ghosts of her own past. The leader of the gang threatening her new home, Hurricane Dalton, was a faceless monster, a symbol of the brutal, lawless world that had taken everything from her. But as her network of scouts and informants, hands and friendly prospectors began to bring her scraps of information about the man, a chilling, impossible suspicion began to form in her mind. They said Dalton was not a common outlaw. He was educated, spoke with a cultured accent when he wasn't playing the part of a frontier brute, and he had a strategic mind that was more like a general's than a bandit's. They said he was a man of furious, unpredictable moods, prone to fits of dark, brooding silence. And one scout brought back a piece of information that made the blood run cold in Clara's veins. He had seen Dalton up close, during a raid on a stagecoach. The man had a distinctive scar on his left hand, a puckered, star-shaped mark, the result of an old dueling wound. Clara's hands trembled as she stoked the fire in her forge, the memory hitting her with the force of a physical blow. She knew that scar. She had seen it countless times in the drawing rooms and ballrooms of her youth in Philadelphia. It was the scar on the hand of her family's closest friend, her father's business partner, the man who had been like an uncle to her. A charming, sophisticated, and deeply ambitious man named Julian Vance. A man who had disappeared without a trace immediately after her family's murder. The pieces began to fall into place, forming a picture of such monstrous, intimate betrayal that it almost shattered her carefully constructed composure. The robbery gone wrong had been no robbery at all. Her father, the brilliant inventor and industrialist, had been on the verge of patenting a new, revolutionary steel forging process that would have been worth millions. Julian Vance had been his partner, the man who handled the finances. He had been the only other person who knew the full details of the invention. He had not just been a friend, he had been a serpent, a Judas who had coveted her father's genius and his fortune. He had orchestrated the entire massacre to steal the plans, to eliminate the only man who could stand in his way, and to inherit a business empire. Hurricane Dalton was not some random force of nature. He was the ghost of Philadelphia, the very man who had destroyed her first life. And now, he had followed her into her second, a specter of greed and violence, come to finish the job he had started 5 years ago. This was no longer just a fight for a town. It was the final, bloody chapter of her own personal history. This revelation changed everything. She now understood the sophisticated, corporate nature of his attacks. He wasn't just a bandit, he was a businessman, using terror as a tool of acquisition. The Great Western Development Company, the front for which the only Mr. Cole worked, was undoubtedly his creation, the legitimate face of his criminal enterprise. He was trying to conquer the West, not with an army, but with a ledger book and a gang of killers, just as he had conquered her family's fortune. The knowledge, while horrifying, also gave her a new and terrible strength. It stripped away the last of her fear, replacing it with a cold, pure, and focused rage. This was no longer an abstract battle against lawlessness. It was a personal vendetta. The ghosts of her father, her mother, and her brothers were now standing beside her in the fire of the forge, demanding justice. She confided in the only person she knew she could trust, Sheriff Thorne. In the quiet of his office, she told him her story. Not the whole story, not the part about the high society of Philadelphia, but the part about the murder, the stolen invention, and the man with the scar on his hand. The old sheriff listened, his face growing grimmer with every word. "I knew there was something more to this," he said, his voice a low rumble. "This ain't just a land grab. This is personal. For him. And for you." He looked at her, his eyes full of a new, profound respect. "You carry a heavy burden, Clara." "It's a burden I intend to set down," she replied, her voice as hard as the steel she forged. One way or another. She now had a new, critical piece of intelligence. She knew her enemy's mind. She knew he was not just a brute, he was a chess player. And she knew that his greatest strength is intelligence, and his arrogance was also his greatest weakness. He would underestimate her. He would see her as the last, loose end from his past, the frightened girl he had failed to kill 5 years ago. He would not see the woman she had become, the iron rose, forged in the very fires he had set. Her strategy shifted. This was no longer just about defending the town. It was about luring the king out from behind his pawns. It was about setting a trap not for Hurricane Dalton, the outlaw, but for Julian Vance, the arrogant, greedy man from Philadelphia. She would use his own history, and his own arrogance, as a weapon against him. She began to formulate a new, far more dangerous plan, a plan designed to force a final, personal confrontation, a reckoning between the ghost of Philadelphia and the blacksmith of Dust Devil Gulch. Clara's new strategy was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, a trap designed for a very specific and very arrogant prey. She knew that Julian Vance, or Hurricane Dalton, believed himself to be a superior being, a man of intellect and breeding operating in a world of brutes. She also knew that the one thing he could not abide was a loose end, a piece of his past that had escaped his control. She was that loose end. To force a confrontation, she had to prove to him that she was not just a survivor, but a threat to his entire new identity. She decided to send him an invitation he could not refuse. She would not send it with a bullet, but with a piece of paper. With the help of Sheriff Thorne, she drafted a legal document, a formal, territorial patent application for a new steel forging process. The details in the application were a direct, word-for-word copy of her father's stolen invention, a document that only two people in the world could have written, her father, and the man who had murdered him to steal it. She signed it not as Clara McCall, but with her true name, Clarissa McAllister. She had the document officially notarized by a traveling circuit judge, giving it the full weight and authority of the law. She then gave this document to one of her scouts, a brave young ranch hand, with instructions to allow himself to be captured by Dalton's men. It was a terrible risk, but the young man, whose family had been saved by Clara's leadership, undertook the mission with a grim resolve. As predicted, the scout was captured. The patent application was found and delivered to Dalton. The effect on the outlaw leader was exactly as Clara had calculated. It was not just a threat, it was a ghost rising from the grave. The name Clarissa McAllister, the precise details of the invention, it was a direct message, a statement that the girl he had left for dead not only remembered everything, but was now using his own stolen dream as a weapon against him. It was an act of such audacious, intellectual defiance that it drove him into a fury. It was an insult to his intelligence, and that was the one thing he could not tolerate. He sent a rider back to town under a white flag. The rider carried a message for the blacksmith. It was a simple, stark invitation. Dalton would meet her, alone, at dawn, at a place of her choosing. If she refused, he would burn Dust Devil Gulch to the ground, and every soul in it. The town council, now a body that included Clara and the sheriff, was thrown into a panic. "It's a trap," Mayor Price blustered. "He'll have a dozen men hiding in the rocks." "Of course it's a trap," Clara replied, her voice calm. "But it is also an opportunity. It's the one I've been waiting for." She looked at the worried faces of her allies. "He thinks he is luring me into an ambush. But the truth is, I have just lured him onto my chessboard. And I will be the one to choose the terrain." She chose her ground with a blacksmith's understanding of heat, stress, and breaking points. Her chosen location was a place known as the Devil's Forge, a narrow, box canyon in the Badlands, its floor a treacherous maze of geothermal vents and steaming, sulfurous pools. It was a volatile, dangerous piece of land, a place where the earth itself was alive and unpredictable. It was a fitting stage for their final confrontation. She accepted Dalton's invitation. The town spent the rest of the day and night in a state of feverish, whispered anxiety. They watched as Clara made her preparations. She did not gather an army. She worked alone in her forge, her hammer ringing late into the night. She was not forging swords or armor. She was crafting a series of small, intricate, and very specific tools. Then, just before dawn, she saddled her horse. She wore her simple, practical buckskins, her father's matched Colt strapped to her hips. She looked not like a victim heading to an execution, but like a master craftsman heading to her workshop to complete her final, most important piece of work. Sheriff Thorne and a dozen of the town's best riflemen rode with her, not into the canyon, but to the ridges overlooking it. "If he breaks his word," the sheriff said, his face a grim mask, "if we see even one of his men, we will rain down hell on him." "He won't break his word," Clara said, her voice full of a strange, chilling certainty. "His pride won't allow it. He needs to do this himself. He needs to personally erase the last piece of his past." As the first, bloody rays of dawn streaked across the sky, Clara McCall, the iron rose, rode alone into the mouth of the Devil's Forge. The steam from the geothermal vents swirling around her like the mists of hell. She was going to meet the ghost of her past, on ground of her own choosing, ready to end the war that had been raging in her soul for 5 long years. The Devil's Forge was a place born of the earth's inner torment. It was a narrow, high-walled canyon, its floor a chaotic landscape of cracked, sun-baked earth, jagged volcanic rock, and hissing geothermal vents that spewed clouds of acrid, sulfurous steam. The air was hot and thick, tasting of brimstone. It was a primal, unsettling place, a landscape that felt both ancient and violently alive. Clara had chosen her ground well. This was not a duelist's flat, open plain, it was a complex, treacherous environment where knowledge of the terrain and the ability to adapt were more important than raw firepower. She dismounted near the canyon entrance, leaving her horse tethered, and proceeded on foot, her movements silent and deliberate. She moved with the confidence of a master craftsman entering her workshop, her stormy gray eyes scanning every rock, every steam vent, every shadow. The tools she had forged the night before were not weapons in the traditional sense. They were small, precisely crafted steel mirrors, polished to a perfect, reflective sheen. She began to place them with a strategist's care, wedging them into cracks in the canyon walls, angling them just so, creating a network of silent, unexpected eyes throughout the canyon. Hurricane Dalton, or as Clara knew him, Julian Vance, was already there. He stood near the center of the canyon, a tall, imposing figure, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. He was dressed not as an outlaw, but as a gentleman duelist, in a fine black coat and trousers. He held a single, elegant, silver-inlaid Colt revolver in his hand. He had come here not for a chaotic gunfight, but for a formal execution, a final, civilized act to erase the last, messy remnant of his past. "Clarissa," he said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that was chillingly familiar, a voice from her childhood nightmares. "I must admit, I am impressed. To survive for so long, to come so far. You have your father's resilience. It is a pity you also inherited his foolishness. The only fool in this canyon, Julian, is the man who believes he can outrun his own shadow," Clara replied, her own voice steady, betraying none of the roiling emotions in her soul. She stopped 30 paces from him, the ground between them a steaming, cracked chessboard. "This is not a debate," he said, raising his pistol. "This is a conclusion. Your father was a brilliant man, but he was weak. He lacked the vision to seize what was rightfully his. I simply took what he was too timid to claim. It was business, Clarissa. Nothing personal. You murdered my family," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "That feels personal to me. A necessary, if regrettable, business expense," he said with a dismissive shrug. "And now, I must close the books." He expected her to draw her guns, to engage in a classic, predictable duel. But Clara did not move. She simply stood there, her hands loose at her sides. "You're right," she said. "It is time to close the books." As she spoke, the sun, which had been behind the eastern canyon wall, crested the ridge. Its first, brilliant rays lanced down into the canyon, and suddenly, the entire landscape was transformed. The network of mirrors Clara had placed caught the morning sun, reflecting it in a dazzling, disorienting web of light. Beams of pure, blinding sunlight shot across the canyon from a dozen different angles, converging on the one spot where Dalton stood. He was momentarily blinded, his eyes, accustomed to the dim morning light, overwhelmed by the sudden, intense glare. He threw up a hand to shield his face, his duelist's composure shattered. And in that moment of blindness, Clara moved. She was a blur of motion, not drawing her guns, but diving for cover behind a large volcanic boulder. Dalton, his vision swimming with bright, dancing spots, fired wildly, his shots ricocheting off the rocks around her, his gentlemanly execution devolving into a panicked, blind fusillade. This was the core of her strategy. She was not a man, and she would not fight like one. She would not meet him on his terms of a face-to-face, honorable duel. Honor was a luxury for men who hadn't listened to their families being murdered. She would fight as she had learned to survive, by being smarter, by using the environment, by turning her opponent's strengths as arrogance, his adherence to a certain code into weaknesses. The canyon became her ally. The steam from the vents provided shifting curtains of cover. The dazzling, reflected sunlight created phantom targets and blinding zones. She moved through this chaotic landscape like a ghost, a hunter in her element, while Dalton, the civilized man, was reduced to a stumbling, half-blind target, his frustration and rage growing with every wasted bullet. The duel he had envisioned as a final, elegant statement had become a terrifying, disorienting nightmare. He was not fighting the frightened girl from Philadelphia. He was fighting the desert itself, and its mistress was the Iron Rose. The battle in the Devil's Forge was not a quick exchange of bullets. It was a slow, grinding war of attrition, a contest of nerves and strategy. Clara, with her intimate knowledge of the trap she had set, had the upper hand. She moved through the steam and the blinding reflections like a phantom, her movements economical and purposeful. She was a constant, unseen presence, a whisper of movement at the edge of Dalton's vision, a ricochet off a rock just above his head. She was not trying to kill him. Not yet. She was dismantling him, piece by piece, stripping away his arrogance, his composure, and his ammunition. Dalton, meanwhile, was a caged lion. His initial, panicked fusillade had emptied his elegant silver Colt. He reloaded, his hands shaking with a mixture of rage and a new, unfamiliar emotion, fear. The girl was not fighting him, she was toying with him. She was hunting him. He was the hurricane, the force of nature, yet here, in this sulphurous hell, he was the one being weathered, eroded. He tried to regain the initiative. He charged from his position, firing into the steam clouds where he thought she was hiding. But she was never there. She would fire a single shot from an entirely different direction, her bullet not aimed at him, but at a loose rock formation on the canyon wall above him, sending a shower of stone and dust raining down, forcing him to scramble for new cover. This was the essence of her strategy. She was the hammer, her sporadic, unpredictable shots the relentless blows. And the canyon itself, treacherous ground, the blinding light, the obscuring steam was the anvil. She was forging his defeat, slowly, deliberately, heating him with frustration, and then hammering him with fear. The psychological toll on Dalton was immense. The sophisticated, controlled man of business began to unravel. His tailored coat was torn, his face was streaked with sweat and grime, and his cultured voice had been reduced to a raw, guttural snarl of frustration. He screamed her name, Clarissa, his voice echoing off the canyon walls, a desperate, angry plea for a straightforward fight he knew he would not get. He realized his only chance was to change the terrain, to neutralize her advantage. He saw the source of the blinding light, the network of mirrors she had placed. With a new, desperate purpose, he began to methodically shoot them, one by one. Each shattered mirror was a small victory, reducing the disorienting glare, bringing a small measure of clarity back to the battlefield. Clara watched this, a grim, approving nod on her face. This was what she had been waiting for. She had forced him to expend his ammunition, to focus his attention, to become predictable. While he was focused on destroying the mirrors on the eastern wall, she was circling, using the steam vents on the western side as cover, moving inexorably closer. The final mirror shattered. The canyon was plunged back into a world of normal, morning light. Dalton stood panting in the center of the canyon, a wild, triumphant look on his face. He had beaten her trick. He had restored the honor of the duel. "No more games, Clarissa," he roared, reloading his pistol one last time. Face me like a man." "I am not a man, Julian," a voice said, calm and cold, from directly behind him. He spun around, his eyes wide with shock. Clara stood there, not 20 feet away, having emerged from a thick cloud of steam. She held her father's matched Colts, not raised, but held loosely at her sides. She had closed the distance, turning his moment of triumph into his final, fatal trap. The duel he had wanted was finally here, a face-to-face confrontation. But it was not on his terms. He was exhausted, his nerves shattered, his confidence a ruin. She was calm, focused, a predator who had finally cornered her prey. The hammer had done its work. Now, it was time for the final, quenching blow. The moment of confrontation was absolute. The steam swirled around them, the desert sun beat down, and the two ghosts of Philadelphia stood facing each other, a lifetime of betrayal and hatred compressed into the 30 feet of cracked, sulfur-stained earth that separated them. Dalton, or Julian Vance, stared at the woman before him, and for the first time, he did not see the frightened girl he had left for dead. He saw a creature of dust and steel, her stormy gray eyes holding a cold finality that terrified him more than any weapon. He saw his own creation, a living testament to his own monstrous act, return to claim her due. His arrogance, his last defense, reasserted itself. "So, you have some fire in you after all," he sneered, his voice a ragged attempt at his old, cultured tone. "But this is where it ends. You cannot win, Clarissa. I am a survivor. It is the one true talent I possess." "You are not a survivor," Clara replied, her voice quiet but resonant in the canyon's stillness. "You are a thief. You stole my father's work. You stole my mother's life. You stole my brother's futures. And you stole my name. I am not Clarissa McAllister. She died in a fire 5 years ago. I am Clara McCall, the blacksmith of Dust Devil Gulch. And I have come to collect a debt." With the last word, she moved. There was no warning, no formal count. Her hands, the calloused, strong hands of a blacksmith, moved with a fluid, practiced grace. The Tukol peacemakers, her father's guns, rose as one, a seamless, beautiful, and deadly motion. Dalton, for all his arrogance, was fast. His own gun came up, a blur of silver and fury. But he was a man driven by a desperate, frantic need to survive. Clara was a woman driven by a cold, pure, and unwavering purpose. And purpose is always faster than desperation. The canyon exploded in a rolling thunder of gunfire. Clara did not fire once. She fired 4 times, 2 shots from each gun, a technique her father had taught her, a perfectly timed, rhythmic volley that sounded like a single, prolonged roar. Dalton's single shot went wide, the bullet screaming off the rocks far to Clara's left. Her 4 shots did not. They were not the wild shots of a panicked fighter. They were the precise, deliberate strikes of a master craftsman. They found their mark in his chest, shattering his survivor's heart. One took him in the shoulder of his gun arm, ruining his aim forever. The last, a final, punctuating blow, struck him squarely in the center of his forehead. He stood for a long, impossible moment, his eyes wide with the ultimate surprise, a man who had orchestrated so many endings, now utterly unable to comprehend his own. He fell not forward, not backward, but straight down, collapsing in on himself like a building whose foundations had been dynamited. He landed in a heap in the dust, a final, messy business expense. Clara stood, the 2 guns still smoking in her hands, the smell of gunpowder sharp and clean in the sulphurous air. She looked down at the body of the man who had haunted her every waking moment and every dream for 5 years. She waited for the flood of triumph, for the release of her hatred, for the feeling of victory. But nothing came. There was no joy. There was no satisfaction. There was only a vast, profound, and aching emptiness. The fire of her vengeance, the furnace that had forged her into the iron rose, had consumed its fuel. And now, in the silence of the canyon, she was left with only the cold ashes. She slowly, mechanically, reloaded the 4 empty chambers in her pistols. Then she walked over to the body. She knelt, not in pity, but in a final act of closure. From inside her shirt, she pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket, the only thing she had taken from her old life. It contained a tiny portrait of her family, smiling, happy, from a world that no longer existed. She opened Dalton's coat and placed the locket on his chest, over the blood stain that was spreading there. "The books are closed, Julian," she whispered. She stood up, turned her back on the body, on the past, on the ghost of Philadelphia, and walked away. The price of steel, she now understood, was fire. And the price of justice, a piece of her own soul. When Clara rode out of the Devil's Forge, she was met on the ridge by Sheriff Thorne and his posse of riflemen. They saw the lone rider, the smoke still faintly curling from her pistols, and they knew. No words were needed. The sheriff simply gave her a long, slow nod, a gesture of profound respect and understanding. The death of Hurricane Dalton and the subsequent capture of his disillusioned, leaderless gang was the event that broke the fever in Dust Devil Gulch. The news that Mr. Cole, the slick representative of the development company, had been found hanged in his hotel room a suicide, it was ruled by a man who had seen his entire enterprise collapse, was the final confirmation that the storm had passed. In the days that followed, the town began the slow, difficult process of waking from a long nightmare. The fear that had been a constant, oppressive presence was gone, replaced by a fragile but persistent sense of hope. The town had been to the brink, and it had survived. And it had survived not because of its strong men or its elected leaders, but because of the quiet, indomitable will of its blacksmith. Clara McCall became a reluctant hero, a living legend. But she did not seek accolades or power. While the town celebrated, she retreated to the one place she felt hold her forge. She threw herself back into her work with a quiet, fierce intensity, the rhythmic clang of her hammer on the anvil a kind of therapy, a way to pound out the ghosts and the emptiness that the final confrontation had left in its wake. But the town she had saved would not leave her alone. They came to her not just for repairs, but for guidance. Sheriff Thorne, his authority now unquestioned, would consult with her on matters of town security. The miners and ranchers, who had once been a disorganized mob, now looked to her to help them form a proper town council, a government of the people, not of the powerful. She found herself, against all her instincts, becoming the architect of the town's future. She used the practical, logical mind that had served her so well in planning the defense to help them plan their new community. She helped them draft a town charter based on principles of fairness and mutual respect. She helped negotiate disputes between ranchers and miners, her reputation for unyielding integrity making her an ideal arbiter. It was in this work, this act of building instead of destroying, that Clara began to find a new kind of peace. The cold emptiness left by her extinguished vengeance was slowly being filled, not with fire and rage, but with the warm, sturdy satisfaction of creation. She was not just reforging steel, she was reforging a community. Her most significant project was a personal one. With a portion of the money recovered from Dalton's gang reparations, the sheriff had bought the old, abandoned mission at the edge of town. She did not tear it down. She began to transform it. With the help of the townswomen, she turned the crumbling adobe building into a school for the town's children, and an orphanage for the many children in the territory who, like her, had been left alone by the West's casual brutality. It was in this act of profound, selfless creation that she began to reforge herself. The Iron Rose, the woman of dust and steel and gunfire, was slowly, carefully, allowing the rose part of her name to bloom again. She was rediscovering the parts of Clarissa McAllister she thought had died in the fire: her love of books, her compassion, her desire to nurture and to build. She found a partner in this new life in the unlikely form of Sheriff Thorne. The old, weary lawman, reawakened by her courage, had become a man of quiet strength and deep integrity. Their relationship was not one of romance, but of a deep, abiding partnership, a bond forged in the heat of battle and tempered in the slow, steady work of building a community. They were the two pillars of the new Dust Devil Gulch, the hammer and the anvil that were shaping its future. Months passed, turning into a year. The raw scars on Dust Devil Gulch began to heal, replaced by the sturdy new growth of a town that had been reborn. The new school at the mission was thriving, its halls filled with the laughter of children who were learning to read and write, their futures brighter than they had ever been. The town council, with its mix of miners, ranchers, and merchants, governed with a fairness and transparency that had once been unthinkable. The town was prosperous, not with the feverish, hollow boom of a mining camp, but with the steady, quiet prosperity of a true community. Clara McCall was at the heart of it all, yet she remained apart. She was the town's revered blacksmith, its unofficial leader, its protector. But she lived a solitary life, her forge her home, her hammer her only constant companion. The ghosts of her past were quieter now, but they were not gone. She had found a purpose, but she had not yet found peace. One evening, as she was banking the fire in her forge, a lone rider arrived in town. He was not a gunslinger or a prospector. He was an older, well-dressed gentleman, a lawyer from Philadelphia. He had been searching for her for years, following a cold trail, acting on behalf of her father's estate. He brought with him a stunning revelation. The men who had worked for Julian Vance, the men who had actually carried out the massacre of her family, had been captured. One of them, facing the gallows, had confessed to everything, implicating Vance in the entire conspiracy. Her family's name had been cleared, their honor restored. And, the lawyer informed her, her father's fortune, which had been tied up in legal battles, was now hers. She was, once again, Clarissa McAllister, one of the wealthiest women in America. The news was a seismic shock. It was the final, definitive closing of the book on her past. The world she had fled, the world of tea and lace, was now offering her a golden bridge back. She could leave Dust Devil Gulch. She could return to Philadelphia, to a life of comfort and ease, a life where she would never again have to smell the sulfur of gunpowder or the soot of the forge. She spent a long night sitting in the darkness of her forge, the legal documents that represented her old life lying on the anvil before her. She thought of the girl she had been, the girl who had loved poetry and music. And she thought of the woman she had become, the woman who found a strange, beautiful music in the ringing of a hammer on steel. She was to people, the rose and the iron. For years, she had thought she had to be one or the other. But now, in the quiet of the night, she understood. The West had not destroyed Clarissa McAllister, it had reforged her. The heat of the desert, the fire of her vengeance, had burned away the weakness, the fragility, and had fused the delicate heart of the rose with the unbreakable strength of the iron. She was not two people. She was one, whole and complete. The next morning, she gave the lawyer her answer. She legally reclaimed her name and her fortune. But she did not return to Philadelphia. She had the bulk of the money transferred to a trust to be used for the continued development and prosperity of Dust Devil Gulch, to build a real hospital, to bring in a permanent doctor, to ensure the orphanage would never want for anything. She kept her forge. She kept her name, Clara, the name she had earned. And she kept her father's guns, not as tools of vengeance, but as a reminder of the price of freedom. The final scene finds her not in a drawing room, but in the schoolyard of the mission. She is no longer covered in soot, but is wearing a simple, practical dress. She is sitting on a bench, a book in her hands, reading to a group of children, both white and Native American, who sit at her feet, their faces rapt with attention. Sheriff Thorne watches from a distance, a quiet, proud smile on his face. The sun sets over the desert, bathing the scene in a warm, golden light. The Iron Rose has found her peace. She was a woman born to one world, and reborn in another. She had been reforged not in dust, steel, and gunfire, but in the fires of her own heart, and had emerged not as a weapon of vengeance, but as a creator of hope. And in the heart of the savage, beautiful West, she had finally, truly, bloomed.